In a stone courtroom somewhere in medieval France, a judge cleared his throat, looked out at the gathered crowd, and formally addressed the defendant. The defendant did not stand. It could not speak. It had no understanding of the charges against it, because the defendant, on trial for murder, was a pig. This wasn't a joke. It wasn't satire, or a strange local custom whispered about in taverns. For roughly 600 years, from the 13th century into the 18th, animals across Europe were formally arrested, appointed lawyers, tried in courts of law, and sometimes executed for crimes, as if they were fully responsible human beings, standing before the judgment of God and man. Pigs were the most common defendants, largely because pigs roamed freely through medieval towns and occasionally, tragically, attacked unattended children. When that happened, the pig wasn't simply put down as a dangerous animal. It was arrested, held in the same jail as human criminals, sometimes for months while the case was prepared. And then it was tried. With the same seriousness given to any human accused of murder, one of the most famous cases took place in Falaise, France, in 1386. A pig had killed an infant, and the court's response was staggering in its formality. The pig was dressed in a jacket, waistcoat, and gloves, made to resemble a man on trial. Witnesses were called, testimony was heard, and when the verdict came down guilty, the pig was publicly executed in the town square, hanged on a gallows built specifically for the occasion, in front of a crowd that had gathered as if watching any human execution. It sounds absurd today, almost like a fever dream of medieval justice, but the people involved were not fools. Educated judges, trained lawyers, and respected clergy participated in these trials with total sincerity. Understanding why requires stepping fully into how the medieval mind understood the world, because the logic, however strange it looks now, was internally consistent. Medieval society believed the entire universe operated under a single moral order. Established directly by God, humans had a place in that order. Animals had a place in that order. Even plants and weather had a place in that order. When something violated that order, whether a murderer, a thief, or a pig that killed a child, it wasn't just breaking a human rule. It was disrupting the cosmic balance itself. And that disruption demanded a formal public correction. Regardless of whether the offender could understand the punishment being handed down, this is why the trials weren't limited to farm animals capable of violence. Insects were formally prosecuted too. In several documented cases across France and Italy, swarms of locusts or weevils that destroyed crops were summoned to ecclesiastical court, quite literally through a public announcement read aloud in the fields where they were living. When the insects failed to appear, as insects invariably do, the court would appoint them a defense attorney anyway, and the case would proceed without them. In absentia, one especially detailed case survives from Saint-Ouen, France, in the 16th century, where a colony of weevils was formally sued by local vineyard owners for destroying their crops. The defense attorney, a real lawyer named Pierre Rembaud, argued passionately that God had created these insects too, and that they had just as much right to eat and live as any other creature. He argued the vineyard owners should share their land rather than seek the insects' destruction. The case dragged on for months, with legal arguments filed on both sides. Before ending, fittingly, without a clear resolution, there's something genuinely moving buried inside that absurdity. A lawyer, centuries before anyone spoke the language of animal rights, stood in a real courtroom and argued that a swarm of crop-destroying weevils deserved legal consideration, simply because they were part of God's creation. The system was strange, but the impulse underneath it, the belief that even the smallest creature deserved a fair hearing before judgment, carries a kind of moral seriousness that's easy to miss beneath the surface silliness. Not every case was this thoughtful. Some trials revealed the darker, more punitive side of medieval justice. Roosters were occasionally tried for the crime of laying an egg, a biological impossibility that was nonetheless treated with total seriousness, because a rooster laying an egg was seen as an unnatural sign, possibly satanic in origin, and therefore dangerous enough to warrant execution by burning cows. Horses, dogs, even a dolphin, in one recorded case, were formally prosecuted for various offenses over the centuries. Rats, notoriously difficult to catch and impossible to summon to court, were sometimes granted extended trial dates by sympathetic judges, on the argument that the rats faced too much danger from local cats to safely travel to the courthouse, and therefore deserved more time to appear. What's remarkable is how seriously the legal formalities were followed. These weren't mock trials or public spectacles staged for entertainment, though the public certainly attended them as entertainment. They followed real procedural law. Evidence was presented. Witnesses were sworn in. Defense attorneys, often skilled and respected members of the legal profession, argued genuinely on behalf of their animal clients, sometimes successfully securing lighter sentences or full acquittals. Underneath all of this is a psychological truth that reaches far beyond animals or the Middle Ages. When something terrible happens, when a child dies, when a harvest is destroyed, when suffering arrives without warning, human beings have an overwhelming need to find meaning in it. Randomness is almost unbearable to the human mind. A tragedy without a cause, without someone or something to hold responsible, feels somehow worse than the tragedy itself. The animal trials offered medieval society something modern courts still offer today: a structured, formal process for transforming chaos into order. A pig killing a child was senseless and horrifying. A pig standing trial, being judged, and receiving a sentence. However irrational the entire process actually was, restored a sense of control over something that felt otherwise uncontrollable. We tend to look back at these trials and laugh, and there's genuine, deserved comedy in picturing a pig dressed in a waistcoat facing a judge, or a courtroom debating the legal rights of a swarm of weevils. But look closer, and there's also something quietly recognizable in it. The same instinct that put a pig on trial in 1386 is the instinct that drives people today to search, desperately for someone to blame after a disaster. To demand accountability, even when true accountability isn't really possible. To need a story that makes sense of suffering, rather than simply accepting that terrible things sometimes happen for no reason at all. The last recorded animal trial took place in the 19th century, technically outside the medieval period, but carrying the same logic forward for hundreds of years after most of Europe had moved past its origins. Eventually, the practice faded, not because anyone proved animals lacked moral responsibility, but because the world slowly shifted toward a different kind of order, one built on science and reason rather than cosmic balance and divine law. Somewhere in that shift, humanity lost something a little bit endearing, if completely irrational: the willingness to formally, seriously ask whether even the smallest, most senseless creature deserved a fair hearing before judgment. The pig never understood the charges against it. The weevils never heard their own defense. But for 6 strange centuries, medieval Europe insisted on giving them one anyway.